Keith, welcome to the show. Thanks for being here today. Super excited to have you and to be talking about such an important topic that a lot of small business owners and just business owners have discussed with me. You know, it's culture, having to do with culture. A lot of people are talking about it, and there's a lot of big questions surrounding it. But before we get into that, Keith, could you just give us a little background on you as a person, from your experience to just what you're doing with your business today?
Sure thing. Thanks very much for your time today. So I am Keith Fuller, founder of All About EX, and this is a service that helps startups handle all things people. And I got into this particular space after many years ago, starting as an engineer in the video games industry of all things, and seeing the impact that big budget, high pressure, deadline driven software development has on the people doing the work. I was really upset with the human cost of chronic stress fatigue and sleep disorders and all these sorts of things. So I set out as a consultant to help fix those sorts of problems through leadership development and addressing company culture, originally in the video game space, but then branched out into all manner of technical fields. After doing that for many years, and typically encountering companies that were 10-year-old, 20-year-old dumpster fires, I really wanted to say, okay, what are we doing in the entrepreneurial space to address these things before they turn into a client like that? Who's teaching entrepreneurs to handle people operations well? How do you learn to set values for your company? How do you learn how to hire and interview well? How to train your first managers, these sorts of things. And that's what led me to create All About EX, so that I can help startups and founders do those sorts of things well from the beginning.
Awesome. Hey, well, that's great. And I'm so happy to have you today on the show as an expert talking about culture. I think people will get a lot of value from this.
Thanks.
So before we really dive in, I think it's always good to kind of redefine, or at least define for this, for the sake of this episode, what culture is. So when we say culture today, what are we talking about?
Sure. So the two really critical terms that I start with there are values and culture. And values, that's what is of utmost importance to your company. These are sometimes aspirational. This is who we want to be. Sometimes they're defining who you are and what you do now, but they are the highest priority items. These are things that we use for accountability, for guidance, for decision making, that the person we hired this morning and the CEO can be held accountable to. So values, super important, but they're words. Culture is action. This is what you actually do. So you may say on the website, we value integrity, but behind the scenes, if say you wind up getting hauled off to jail in cuffs because you've been cooking the books, your culture was not in fact one of integrity. Only your values were. So that is an example of values versus culture, what you say and what you do. And culture clearly is hugely important because that's what actually happens.
Yeah, love that, and so correct on that as well. So when I talk to small business owners, a lot of them, think about culture. They say, well, I don't have time for that, or, when should I even start thinking about culture? Like maybe I only have 2 employees. Is it really important that I think about culture today? In your opinion, Keith, like when is the best time to start thinking about culture for your business?
Sure. So I understand, especially in the startup space or small business space, the conventional wisdom is, well, listen, at the outset, you need to have a product before you can really start worrying about these bigger picture company things. And you need a team before you can have a product, right? So these are a lot of the concerns that are in the space today. What I would say then is, okay, so what you're essentially saying is, I'm going to put cultural considerations at maybe 3rd or 4th place on these lists of priorities. And the difficulty that I have with that is like we just touched on, the distinction between what we say we are about and what we actually do. Is it okay with you if something that is inherently at odds with who you want to be and who you want your company to be, is it okay with you if your first team member does something that is antithetical?
Really, I mean, would you consider culture, um, and those fundamental values, they can be an important part of like how you grow and how you scale. Would you agree with that?
Oh,
From
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the a classic example that I point to, and one that you'll read about in the cultural space a lot. If you look at Netflix, right? Here's a company that started off clearly with great ideas, with good technical background, these sorts of things, but to be able to scale and just take over an industry as they have, they had to have a really well-defined culture. And their CEO, Reed Hastings, was one of the first people that I know who quoted as saying, "Never suffer a brilliant jerk." Like, as much as they put on, we have to have the smartest people, the best engineers. Even that CEO said, it's not just about output, it's about behavior. And if you don't have a culture defined, how do you know what a jerk is?
You just feel it, Keith.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's how you'll wind up firing somebody based on that's a good move.
Yeah. So one of the things, I always, when I talk with small business owners, um, ROI is really important, right?
Sure.
They're going to invest in something, let it be their time or their money. They want to see an ROI. And a lot of times, we attach money to ROI. But when it comes to culture, and when you start setting business goals that you want to achieve with culture, like what are some of those business goals? What are some of those metrics that you've seen and that you think would be relevant to small businesses, especially, um, that they could include in that ROI metric that they're trying to achieve with taking some action and investing in company culture?
Sure, sure. So there's a Harvard Business Review study that came out a while back, and it points to they looked at hundreds of companies across multiple industries, and they said, listen, here's what we found. These companies that invest in employee experience are 4 times more profitable than their market average competitors. Now, that's probably looking at larger companies as opposed to kind of small business owners. So while that's useful information, we'll just kind of set that aside and say, well, let's talk small business. When you are looking at your first ever set of hires, you're going to be hiring your first 1, 2, 3 employees. How much can you afford to make an incredible mistake with one of those? Right? If you are hiring your first person ever and it winds up costing you $10,000 because you hired the wrong person and it took you months to fire them, that's an enormous expense for a small business. And you wasted the time of having the wrong person on board, and you wasted your time and effort of having to deal with it as the business owner. That's an
Mhm.
incredible expense just from one poor hire. Now, there's no way that anybody anywhere is 100% hitting success when it comes to interviewing and hiring employees. It just doesn't happen. But culturally, there are absolutely some things that you can do to improve your chances of hiring well, which is clearly so critical with your first few people. If you don't have your values explicitly documented, that's going to be a problem for figuring out who to hire. And if you don't make it a cultural practice of asking interview questions directly pertinent to your values, that's going to be a problem as well. You're just throwing darts as to whether you're going to get a good hire or not. And
Yeah.
for a small business owner, they will absolutely tell you, especially if they've made the mistake of a bad hire, how expensive that can be.
And not necessarily expensive even in dollar amounts, right? Like, I mean, sure, you could sit down and get the calculator out in a Google sheet and figure out, well, I spent 20 hours a week training this person and my time is valued at this, and they they only generated this much revenue for themselves and yada yada. But that's not really the most important part of this, right? I mean, like a lot of times for small businesses, the ROI is seen in other ways, right? Like just less friction, less
Oh, absolutely.
stress, fewer problems. And that's kind of what you were touching on there. Is it's not always about dollar amounts with ROI.
Right.
It's more than that. And a
Yeah.
lot of times for small businesses, I mean, I think large corporations, they have people who measure this stuff, right? Like
Right.
they have
That entire
people,
teams. Yeah.
yeah, who are set out to make sure that, okay, we invested maybe $100,000 in this software, this with this consultant, and did we see a direct ROI on that? Well, with small businesses, you know maybe it's a scale thing, but also it's you just don't have a team that's sitting there
Right.
crunching the numbers and
Yeah. The
figuring this
bigger
out.
companies can look at things like, well, since we started putting money into an employee wellness program, we have reduced employee absenteeism by 10%, right? Okay,
Yeah,
so bigger companies have more data to look at, and they have people to look at the data.
yeah,
Uh, but for a smaller company, if it's 5, 10, 20 people, one of the key ways that is going to show up in terms of culture improvement or these sorts of things, for the CEO, for the business owner, there are things that are giving you grief. There are things in your daily, weekly business hours that are points of friction for you. They are things that exasperate you, that you have to spend time on, you wish you didn't, any of those sorts of things. And those will eventually become the fire closest to the door if left unattended. But
yeah,
also, if somebody just comes in and fixes whatever that friction point is for you, you may not be able to put a dollar sign on that, but oh my gosh, my life is so much better now that I don't have to deal with X every Wednesday morning or what have you.
yeah,
It may not be
yeah,
directly measurable, but it's something that you, as the business owner, recognize as being valuable.
yeah, for sure. And I like being transparent about that, especially when we talk with clients and customers. It's not always an ROI thing. A ROI with dollar thing. It's a ROI with whatever pain you're trying to get rid of or friction you're trying to get rid of, which is, I think, really important. So
Yeah.
just,
What's your convenience worth?
yeah, exactly. Love that. So I want to just talk about, some specific examples of companies using culture to achieve a business goal. And we can, one of the most common ones that I see on a daily and weekly basis is when I talk with small business owners about knowledge sharing. And, far too often I talk with a small business owner, I show them, how important knowledge sharing is to their business. And the first thing they say is, well, my employees would never share their knowledge. Like they feel like if they document, use your app or use, even just Microsoft Word and document how they do something, then they feel like I could just fire them and hire someone cheaper,
Right.
to just
What
save
am I
some
training
money.
my replacement already? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, it happens all the time. And one of the things I think about with that, and tell me what your thoughts are on this, or what your thoughts are on this, Keith. But when your employees are so afraid to share knowledge, there's no app on God's green earth. There's no process or anything. Like, here's how you document stuff that you can implement. Really, what the problem is that you have a cultural issue. If your employees feel so unsafe that they can't do something as simple as just telling other people how to do something that they've perfected over their tenure at your company, it's a culture thing. And it that insecurity, I believe, comes from top down, right? It's something that needs to be changed from the top down. And this is especially true in small businesses. And I think where a lot of small businesses like eventually have issues is, they hire someone, they train them,
Yep.
the person becomes an innovator for them on the base floor of their business. They build up all this knowledge, and then humans retire or they die or whatever it is, and then the small business is kind of stuck. They're like, well, we have nothing. How did they do that? Or you don't even realize some of the things that they did until they no longer are there. And so this is one of those
A lot of companies will call that the hit by a bus rule, right?
Yeah, yeah.
What happens if this person gets hit by a bus? I prefer the what if they win the lottery?
Yeah.
It's a little bit less grisly.
Yeah, I
but
like
the point
that.
is still the same, right? If this person never showed up at work again, what would we lose?
Yeah. And so this is one of those, like, what the prime example, I think, of using culture to achieve a business goal. And that can not necessarily be, like we've been saying, you'll save all this money, but just making your business healthier for the future and setting your business up for the future. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on that? I mean, this is a common scenario. I think it's definitely more common in small businesses. But how can, as a business owner, like, what's the next step? If you identify that your business is like that your culture isn't working for setting yourself up for the future, like, what do you think about that? And what are some steps that business owners can take?
Man, on that specific topic, the concept of knowledge sharing, people not feeling safe. First of all, I'm pretty sure there are 8 different kinds of insurance that a small business owner already has, right? If it's fire insurance, health insurance, life insurance, whatever. Similarly, knowledge transfer is a level of insurance, as we just discussed. Someone wins the lottery and they don't show up again tomorrow. But why that would be in your company is a fascinating line of questioning. If I had a CEO tell me that exact same thing, oh, my people won't share knowledge with each other, they're afraid that makes them irrelevant or redundant or something. My first question would be, okay, do you think that's healthy? Right? Like, is that a good thing? Is that the sort of place you want to run, that people are afraid of sharing knowledge because then clearly they wonon't have value to the company anymore? Okay, so 1, do you think that's healthy? And then 2, and I think this is more, so your more recent point there, I would then ask, why do you think that is, that they feel that way? And to your point, culture, everybody impacts culture, but it is disproportionately driven by the decisions of leadership.
Yeah.
So especially in a small business, everybody has more interactions with each other. The CEO isn't often some corporate HQ in another state. They're probably right next to you day in and day out, right? The business owner themselves. So their impact on the culture is going to be felt more directly and more frequently by everybody there. So if you've got a bunch of folks who are afraid to share knowledge and think the hoarding it is the only reason they stay employed, you're probably creating that atmosphere by some set of actions and decisions that you, the business owner, are taking. So if you don't want them to be that way, my first thought is that's up to you to inculcate different practices, teaching people, nope, we value knowledge sharing here. And it does the opposite of making you less valuable as an employee.
Yeah, and that brings up, an example of a business leader that I've talked to here in the Fox Cities that is retired now, but talked about when they were running their business, they had an employee who was hoarding all of their knowledge, kind of a management kind of role that they had in their office, and they were hoarding this knowledge and, just wouldn't pass it along, kind of had to control everything. And this business leader that I've talked to several times, he told me that, he just had to have a conversation with this employee. And the conversation basically was, if you don't share the knowledge that you've refined and that the processes that you've, created, I can't promote you to better things because you aren't sharing it. I can't have someone else take care of this. And to a bigger point, and maybe a more extreme point, he said, if you don't share it, then I think I need to let you go, because we have to have this we can't depend on you this much. It's right along the same lines. If you win the lottery, then I'm screwed, because no one knows how to do anything.
Are rarely a good idea.
Yeah. So, kind of an interesting example, I think, of, um, how you can make sure that your employees and your team know that you value knowledge sharing,
Yep.
and you value it because it opens up more doors and more opportunity for these employees, these rockstar employees who know how your business works, to then help bring the business to the next level, and help bring their careers to the next level, which I think is kind of cool.
Absolutely.
So, we've touched a lot of really awesome points here. And I know it was a lot about knowledge sharing and knowledge management, but you can apply this to literally, um, I'm having a hard time thinking of any business goal that you wouldn't be able to apply some kind of cultural, solution to, even like, are there any that come to mind for you, Keith? I'm even thinking, if you want to hire rock stars, right, you have to think about your culture and make it a culture that is desired by people. That could be a business goal if you need to expand your team. um, you know uh, Culture when it comes to sales is a big thing, I think, as well. That it's not always about, um, you know it's not always about dollar amounts. It's about, um, hitting other kind of sales goals as well, and making sure that you are honest all the time and building good relationships with your customers and all this kind of stuff. um,
Right.
there's lots of business goals that I think that you can achieve with thinking about culture. If there are any other that you want to touch on as we kind of wrap up here, let me know. But the next question that I had for you today is, what are some practical exercises that business owners can use to start crafting a culture that's going to bring a desired result? So if there's any other examples, feel free to share them. But also just kind of practical things that people can do.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. The first step that I've gone through with clients that I recommend to any business owner is you absolutely need to think through what are your values as a company, and you need to document those. It's not enough that you say, "Oh, well, everybody knows." No, I'm gonna stop you right there. It's not everybody, and it's not knows. So, first of all, write your values down. If it's 3, if it's 30, whatever, but make sure those are clear and they're documented. So, this is what we are going to base our decisions on. And then you can start looking at the practices that are part of your company in light of that standard. So, the classic example that people will point to in tech is when years ago, Google had one of their values that said, "Don't be evil." Okay, well, that's kind of broad, but it's part of their values, so yay. That was a key deciding factor in whether they allowed Google to be used as a search engine in China, because China wanted to be able to censor results and these sorts of things. So famously, Google actually made the decision originally to not be operating in China because they felt it was counter to one of their values. So that's an example. So first of all, make those values clear and make sure everybody knows what they are. I suggest sharing them with job candidates, talking about them in interviews, putting them on the website, these sorts of things. And another practical exercise that I would suggest, and this is a very personal one for leaders. Understand, we talked about a second ago, your actions as a leader have significant impact on the culture of the company. So if you don't want a salesperson to be known for lying to customers, well, what if you found out that one of your salespeople was, in fact, occasionally bending the truth? How do you think they came to think that was okay at your company? That's because of the culture that you're setting as a leader. So the practical exercise there is for you to be self-aware, to be looking at your own activities and thinking in those light, boy, anytime I see something go wrong at our company, anytime that I see we are not living up to the standard I want to set, how can I trace that back to the actions that I'm taking?
Awesome. Yeah. And it's a really strong point there. Great way to wrap this up. So, yeah, awesome, Keith. Is there any way that people should get in touch with you if they're interested in talking with you? about culture, any questions they have from this webinar, or working with your business, what's the best way to get in touch?
Yeah, happy to talk to folks further. Allaboutex.com is our website. And you can also find me on Twitter. You can look up We Are All About EX. And happy to talk all things culture and people practices at pretty much any time.
Awesome. Cool. Well, hey, thanks a lot, Keith. And thanks to anyone listening today. All About EX, Keith Fuller. Thank you very much.
Thanks for your time, Andrew. Great talking with you.